Good afternoon, Miss Gracia. My name is Julio Pérez, and it's a pleasure to interview our expert, Dr. Komar. He has a Ph.D. in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Kansas in the United States, and has written more than 200 technical reports about biodiversity, including 45 papers published in international scientific journals. So, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Komar. The topic is the birds in the cities. How the bird population in cities are affected by the urbanization and also the diversity of the bird population. Um, I have read some articles where the authors make comparisons between different cities to study like the diversity of the cities. So this way they can compare like if some birds are have a bigger population in the city in I mean between the city and their natural habitat. So by your experience, what do you think about the birds that has a higher a higher number in the cities?
Sí, sí, muy bien. No, that's a very good question. I think there are birds that have higher population densities in cities than perhaps in the natural habitats. And a good example is the rufous-naped wren, what they call in El Salvador the huacalchilla.
Yeah.
Do you know that bird?
Yes.
It's very common here among the buildings in Zamorano campus. They love to look for food underneath the eaves of roofs and along windowsills.
Yeah.
They benefit from the structures that humans build in cities, and they fill niches that are otherwise absent or vacant is the word. The vacant niches that are available for them. So in cities they become very, very abundant. Another one is the ruddy ground dove that becomes very abundant, nests in everybody's garden.
Yeah.
Or on their window. Almost everybody's house in San Salvador, for example, a city that you know, every house has a nest of the ruddy ground dove.
Yes.
There must be hundreds of thousands of ruddy ground doves, or maybe millions, living in the city. There are ruddy ground doves in the countryside also, and there are rufous-naped wrens in the countryside also. But certainly, there are quite a few species of birds that have adapted to living in cities, and that live very well with humans. There are some birds that almost exclusively live in cities, such as the what we call in Spanish the paloma de Castilla, or the rock pigeon. Yeah. In English, it's called the rock pigeon. The natural habitat of that bird is huge cliffs out in mountains, and in Central America, you don't find it on cliffs; you find it in cities.
Yeah. So, according to the distribution of the population of birds in the cities, do you think that these cities that can become a plague on the cities has some characteristics that makes them to be successful in the city?
The birds, you mean? The birds that are common in cities, you're wondering if they have a particular characteristic? Yes. That's a good question. There are some birds that you never see in cities. But I would say that the ones that we see in cities are the species that are adapted to disturbance. And there are some species that benefit from disturbance. And they're usually called generalist species, but there are some species that are so generalist that they actually need disturbance. So they only live in areas where there's disturbance. So you said, what is the characteristic that makes them common in cities? I think that was your question. And I would say that these are birds that are adapted to disturbance. That means that they look for places that have been disturbed in order to live, because presumably in places that have been disturbed, that means that the species that were originally there might have left because of the disturbance. And so that means there's open niches, vacant niches that can be that they can take advantage of. Those are the disturbance specialists. What I call a disturbance specialist, such as a great-tailed grackle, which in Spanish is called the sanate. Another one is the the sorsal, the clay-colored thrush. You find those birds wherever there's disturbance.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but some of these characteristics maybe could be the size of the bird, and or the type of food they consume.
Well, I would say no, actually, because if you go into a city, you can find small birds like hummingbirds and very small seed-eating birds, but you can also find large birds like vultures or hawks. Hawks are surprisingly common in cities. Hawks are birds of prey that a lot of people think of as requiring natural habitat, but you can often find hawks and falcons living in cities. Even storks. I've seen storks in Tegucigalpa. In the river that flows through the middle of Tegucigalpa, there's a very polluted river. I've seen storks in that river.
Okay.
They're huge birds.
Yes. Okay. According to the studies that I previously read, they said that a factor that determines the distribution of the diversity of the birds in the cities could be the type of food that they eat. For example, the great-tailed crackle. It's an omnivorous bird, right?
Yes.
And the distribution of that bird is higher than the falcons that just eat another birds of small animals.
Well, but there are falcons in cities also.
Yes. But in terms of the distribution of the diversity in the city.
Well, okay, I think it's a good hypothesis. It's a good idea. But I think that we'll find, if we research that hypothesis, that it doesn't actually hold up, because I've seen fruit-eating birds in cities, birds that exclusively eat fruit. I've seen meat-eating birds, carnivorous birds that exclusively eat, live animals such as rats or birds. There are insectivores that live in cities. There are omnivores that live in cities. There are carrion eaters that live in cities. So it seems like we have the whole. If there's a niche, or if there's food available, there will be birds to take advantage of that niche. And there's all kinds of food in cities.
Yeah. But well,
including, because remember, cities include city parks. So you have you've got seeds coming off the grass and the bushes and the trees. You've got fruit. You've got animals and insects which can serve as food, right?
Yeah, not just by the environment, also for the garbage of the people.
That's right. If you go to a garbage dump, you find lots of birds.
Yeah.
Now you don't find a lot of different species,
yes.
but you find plenty of birds. You find grackles and vultures. There are also birds that only eat vegetation in cities. Leaf-eating birds, such as saltators. Greatest saltator is an example. It lives in people's gardens, and it eats papaya leaves, for example.
And do you think that the territorial behavior of the birds affect their distribution on the cities? For example, the pigeons, does they have a territorial behavior in compare with the other species of doves?
Pigeons do not. Most doves are not territorial.
Okay.
Partly that's because of the doves' eating habits. They eat grains and fruits, and they often do better to form flocks and find food in flocks. They get more protection from predators in flocks, so they prefer to be in a flock.
Yeah.
But there are territorial birds in the cities, such as decay the infrastructure. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I've never heard of infrastructure being decayed by excrement from
or
birds.
the activity of the birds in the infrastructure, for example.
No, I mean, I don't think that the infrastructure itself would be very affected. I think people's appreciation of the infrastructure might be affected. The bird watchers love it. The rest of the people hate it.
Yeah.
Because
of the noise and
maybe because of the noise. Honestly, I don't think it's a big problem for the infrastructure. It may be a problem for some people, but not for the infrastructure. At least I've never heard of it becoming a big problem for infrastructure.
What about the birds that are vectors of diseases?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting problem. There are certain viruses, for example, that the birds are usually not vectors, they're usually hosts. And then the mosquitoes that bite the birds are vectors to carry the virus from a bird, for example, to a human. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
But birds as vectors, I don't think it's an issue. It's birds as hosts to viruses, or at least birds involved in the transmission cycle is the issue that you're talking about. I haven't actually heard of that being a big problem in cities. It can be a problem sometimes in rural areas for people who live close to a large bird roost. And then there's a lot of mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes may affect those people. Like, for example, West Nile virus is a disease where birds are involved in the amplification of the virus epidemic.
Yeah.
But usually it's not a big problem inside a city. It's usually a problem more in rural areas.
Okay. Well, and finishing, what's your opinion about the birds that become plagues in the cities? Does it have something to do with, about that they does not have a predator, or just because of their characteristics?
I guess, it's interesting when you talk about a bird becoming a plaga or plague, a pest. I think the word in English would be a pest in the city. In the city, that's a very subjective evaluation. When is a bird actually a pest? When people are bothered by it. So, for example, pigeons might be considered a pest to some people. Grackles might be considered a pest for people who live near a grackle roost.
Yeah.
But for the rest of the people, it's just a bird out there.
Yeah.
So now let's see. I think maybe I confused myself. What was the question about the plaga, the pests? What was your question about the pests?
Do you think that they become pests because of their own characteristics that makes them successful in the city, or because of the absence of a predator?
Yeah, well, I think there are predators in the city, but I think that these are birds. If we're talking about grackles and pigeons, basically, I'm trying to think what else would be considered a pest. Probably just grackles and pigeons.
Yeah.
These are birds that normally form large roosts, or even colonies, breeding colonies, and they're only really considered pests when people live near these roosts or colonies and they don't like the noise, or they don't like the droppings. But the formation of these large colonies is precisely a kind of an adaptation for them to protect themselves from predators. So it doesn't mean that there's no predators. It's just this is the way these birds have evolved, and they form these kinds of concentrations outside of the cities as well as inside the cities, with the exception of the pigeon, which the pigeons don't seem to survive outside of the cities.
Okay.
Probably because of predators.
Maybe.
Probably.
Okay. Well, that's all. Thank you very much for your time,
You're welcome,
Dr. Komar.
Julio.
And thank you too for watching the video.